Welcome to Let's Talk Transportation, a podcast series of the Broward Metropolitan Planning Organization, also known as the MPO. We talk about the ins and outs of transportation in Broward County and all of Southeast Florida, why it matters, how it works, and the challenges and opportunities related to achieving great transportation. I'm your host, Greg Stewart, Executive Director of the MPO, and I'm joined by
Patricia Zeiler, Executive Director of History Fort Lauderdale.
We're going to actually start back in a conversation you and I have been having about the FEC Railroad, the original railroad down here into Southeast Florida, and actually what it meant to South Florida, and particularly Broward County, because we were pretty much a rural location for many decades. So you want to talk a little bit about how the FEC went in and what Mary Brickell actually smartly owning all that land in that area.
So we always talk to folks about the deep history of Fort Lauderdale or Broward County with the Tequesta and Seminole people, and the river was really the main highway. In fact, the original plats of the city of Fort Lauderdale had Las Olas as the zero, east-west sort of artery, and that changed with Skemmerhorn in 1928. So it's kind of funny when you do property research, you've got to look at a before and after 1928, but that was how the original settlers thought. And then, of course, there was the 1896 coming of Flagler's Railroad. That was the big game changer, because people don't realize today, because, you know, of all the wonderful work county's done and you've done, but there weren't roads. It was swamp, so that railroad was game-changing. So Mary Brickell owned 4 square miles of the New River by 1890. What people don't know is Mary Brickell and Julia Tuttle, who was a Strucevan, and Henry Flagler all knew each other from Standard Oil in Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay.
So the Brickells came down there, even where there's some contention between them. Well, Mary knew Henry Flagler's railroad pre-1896 had stopped in West Palm. He was done. He built Whitehall. He built, his hotel. He was done. So then the big freeze came in 1895, and he got convinced, okay, we're going to move this railroad further south. So Mary Brickell was very farsighted, had already bought up all the New River and every place where he needed to cross. Well, the very first plot that Mary bought was the very first plat that was ever done in Broward County in 1825 for Frankie Lewis, that was the very first property owner in all Broward County.
Lewis.
And it was a woman, not a man. So
really?
Yeah.
Frankie Lewis.
It was assumed that she was a man until it's a long story. There was a spy mission up the New River in 1793, and they identified her as a woman, but that wasn't translated until 1953.
Interesting.
Yeah. So she owned that land, and I think Mary sort of identified that as the most valuable piece of property she had, and that would have been the direct path for Henry Flagler's railroad. And she said, I'll give you the land, but you're going to move it out here away from my prime real estate. And that's exactly why the FCC track, that's how the tracks, or the actual path of the railroad bed, was determined because Mary owned all that property in 1896.
So in a way, the property owner of this Mary Brickell was actually kind of forcing the hand of this multi-billionaire, even in those days, Henry Flagler, and his railroad going to Miami and then ultimately to the Keys. Kind of interesting, the whole role. And they all knew each other from Cleveland?
She and the Flaglers, of course, William, her husband, and then the Strucevants, that's the maiden name of Julia Tuttle.
Oh, okay.
So they were all sort of friends or knew each other well before they came to Miami.
And so the Julia Tuttle Causeway down in Miami, for those of you who don't know where that is, obviously it's in Miami, but really kind of those are names you see on signs, but you don't realize their impact on our history. So, when that ended up happening, and I guess they decided they were going to have a train station here in Fort Lauderdale, or the area that became Fort Lauderdale. What was it called? Was it always called Fort Lauderdale? What was the station called?
So it was called, sometimes it was called the New River Settlement.
Okay.
But Fort Lauderdale is sort of the name that stuck, and that came from the naming of that temporary fort back in 1838 with Major William Lauderdale. So that's kind of where that came from. The position of that original train station there at the river, which people have a real tough time understanding today, everything west of the FEC tracks in Broward County was farmland.
Okay.
And so the positioning was perfect because farmers along the river would, harvest crops, box them or crate them, whatever, put them on a barge, float them upriver to the train station, and they were loaded immediately and went up north to the winter markets. So it was really a great positioning for the spot. And we have great pictures in our library of all of those barges loading and unloading in the train station.
For the people listening in, where can they go to see some of these pictures?
We can go to historyfortlauderdale.org. There's a few pictures there. There'll be more. We're just redoing our website, so in the future you'll see more.
Okay, but can they come to the museum itself?
Absolutely.
Where's the museum at?
So the museum is 6 buildings in total. Our main headquarters is 219 Southwest 2nd Avenue, and we're right just on the street that is on the side of the west side of the FEC tracks, because our main museum, one of our 6 buildings, was the original railroad hotel. So
Perfect.
That's why we're there.
Perfect. So if you're listening in and you have some interest, it's a fascinating area to actually walk around and see, because Broward actually does have history. It's not all Walgreens and CVS's. So the bigger picture, I'm going to ask you further on this. So the farmers would bring in product and they would take it north on the train. What type of what were they growing here? What was a seasonal crop?
So it's surprising. It's a lot more than you think. So pineapples was a really big crop. Citrus was really big. But remember, the very first citrus plants, significant citrus crops planting would have been like 1895, 1896. And it takes a couple of years for those crops to come in. So in the meantime, they were doing everything you can think of: squash, potatoes, tomatoes. There was William Marshall, who was the first mayor of the city of Fort Lauderdale, was a millionaire in tomatoes by the time he became the mayor in 1911.
1911.
In tomatoes, right?
That's pretty cool. I mean, as a kid growing up here, we always went to the U-Pick farms, and to me, the U-Pick, and this is hard for people to even relate to that might be listening today, west of 95 was all tomato fields when I remember it as a child. So, and I know you're from down here as well, so you have that same cognitive knowledge of like, wow, where are these things now? The golf course communities and, condos and houses everywhere. But so the tomato crop actually made the first mayor of Fort Lauderdale a millionaire.
Yes.
It wasn't real estate.
No.
And that's the thing that when I have conversations with people about Broward, especially in Fort Lauderdale, they think, oh, well, it was the train that brought development, and development made people show up. That might have been true right from Miami or West Palm Beach Island, but Broward kind of stayed in its humble roots as a farming and agricultural area, didn't it?
Until the late teens, or around about 1920, there was a huge land boom in Broward County from 1920 until about 1926. And there were a couple of things that brought about the collapse of that market. There's a wonderful book called Bubbles in the Sand. It talks about the real estate bust of Miami-Dade County and Broward County being the catalyst that brought about the entire depression of 1929.
Really?
Yeah, it's really cool. It's cool how he worked it out. But so what happened was, in that early agricultural time, there was a lot of gentlemen like Mr. Marshall who were buying up property too. And then, as people began to come and do mostly winter visitors, it was a much larger winter population than it is today. So they would come for, like 3 months, 4 months to get away from the really worst of the winter weather. And they were a lot of spec houses. So they'd build a house and it would only be it would be empty 6 months of the year because it wouldn't be rented. But that was lucrative enough at the time, because these were not like houses we think of today, right? They were little cottages,
Maybe one bathroom, 2 bedroom.
Maybe even if there was a bathroom. yeah.
Outhouse.
Yeah. But so that was sort of the beginning of it. And then at that whole transition from agricultural to land boom by 1920, that had really but there were great investors who came from the Midwest. So we have Thomas Stilwell, Meringue, there's a number of them. They immediately invested in all the property that was east of what's today's 15th Avenue, and that was all mangroves. So they started dredging projects immediately. So with that whole Venice of America thing that we have here, they were the inventors of that. That was one of their sales sort of presentations that they used to let people know that you were living in like the Venice of America.
So the Las Olas Boulevard of the world, as you drop down, because you can actually physically see the steep drop into the Isles, the Venice of America. That was all mangroves, and so they basically created land there, is what you're saying.
Oh yes, that was it. That was the first really big push, because that started even before the city was incorporated in 1911, and then we have photographs of them actually dredging those things, like in the 1918, 1917, because Governor Broward started the dredging project for Lake Okeechobee and the North New River Canal in 1906.
Okay.
So that sort of, and those dredges were built here in Broward County and floated up the river. So people were like, "Whoa, we can do this here, we can do this there," So that's kind of how that all started. And these gentlemen who developed in that Bubbles in the Sand book, they actually met with like Carl Fisher and some of the developers of like Miami Beach. So that's how, and they sort of got these ideas of how they would develop in their sales pitches. And those developments east of 15th Avenue, which is the coastal ridge, even after the land bust of 1926. That's the only lucrative land sales that happened until probably post-World War II.
So the transportation system here in Broward and Fort Lauderdale in general would have been the station, would have been a little bit of Las Olas going out to Las Olas Isles, would have spread north how far? 15th, I know where 15th Avenue is. I live very close to that. So
maybe north to like through Progresso Village in those days.
Okay.
So that would have been all sort of, there would have been transportation in there. And a gentleman named Mr. Swaggerty ran the very first private bus system in the city.
Oh,
so
interesting.
Right? But see, remember, you couldn't even get to the beach until 1917 because there was no causeways. There was no bridges over the intercoastal waterways. So the very first causeway bridge was completed in 1917, and that was Las Olas Boulevard.
Okay,
that was like a really big deal.
So the developers that came in to dredge the canals and put the fill in the old mangrove areas, then finally got their road to the beach in 17. And then that start construction on the beachfront as well, or was there construction up there?
A little. See, in the beach, the early days of the beach, it was Hugh Taylor Birch and his partner John Adams, and they had a huge fight. So they split their land in half. You can even see in the old pictures, they cut down all the trees to make this swath that showed where the land changed. It's really funny.
Great neighbors.
Right. So Mr. Adams built what he called the Las Olas Lodge, right on the corner of Las Olas Boulevard and A1A, probably in about, that was completed, and it was a masonry structure, believe it or not, completed about 1902, 1903.
So are we talking where the new park is now, or are we talking where the elbow room
The new
is?
park.
Okay.
Yes.
When I was a child, there was a Holiday Inn there.
I know, me too.
Yeah. And so they tore down that, I guess, and then built the Holiday Inn.
Well, it was damaged really badly in the 26 hurricane.
Oh, okay.
And then it was, so it was, they tried to make some repairs on it, but it was never. And the thing I find so funny about that is when it was just brand new and completed in 1902, they called it the Las Olas Hunting Lodge.
Huh.
And who would think of hunting? But even like later, because Bonnet House just north of there was the big property that Hugh Taylor Birch gave to his daughter. And that was completed in 1925. And we have the story from the Bartletts that talks about them shooting a Florida panther right in the front yard as they were trying to move in.
Wow.
You don't think about,
wildlife like that.
exactly on the barrier.
So we had the Depression and everything stopped. And the hurricane came, kind of put the kibosh to everything.
Yeah.
Caused our real estate investment market caused a collapse of the entire stock market. Great for us. But bigger picture, then the stock market adjusted. We came out of the recession, and I guess that was the start of World War II. Can you talk to me about how, what did Broward and Fort Lauderdale look like at that moment in time?
So Broward was probably no more than 30 or 40,000 residents at that time, pretty stretched out across the county, not in the extreme western areas of the county.
Yeah.
So and of course, as you remember as a kid, I remember too, they're highly agricultural. We've got pictures of the farms on Oakland Park Boulevard.
Right, exactly.
So it was still largely agricultural. The East End, which was the same for Dania and Hollywood and Pompano Beach. All that eastern side was where the real development was happening because because people wanted to be by the beach and by the water, and that was kind of the attraction. So then World War II, and the things that really changed there were, first of all, Broward County was rejected by the USO for a USO-funded base.
Interesting.
So Broward County residents, believe it or not, got together themselves and created service centers for the GIs that were here, because we were a large concentration of Air Force, some Navy, and Coast Guard. So we had these, kind of a lot of young men in the area coming through, and they needed service centers and places to meet people and stuff to do.
So where Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport is today, that was an Air Force base, correct?
Yes.
And Port Everglades, I think that's Lake Mabel. Was that what it was called?
Yeah, so Port Everglades would have been started in 1928, and then it became a naval base for World War II.
So really the naval roots of this area, actually, and Air Force roots actually created, is that what brought the GIs maybe back and created the next land boom here?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've studied this quite a bit at Historical Society. So yes, the general thinking is that GIs came, they saw paradise.
Right.
No snow, no shovel, right? It was
ice.
Right. So they came back, and it was sort of in the conjunction of the beginning of air conditioning, DDT, all these young guys on the GI Bill coming back and being able to get GI financing for homes. There was a huge house explosion after World War II. But the other thing that's really unique to Broward County is in 1948, a young couple from I'm going to get this wrong, Michigan, I'm pretty sure.
A lot of Midwesterners.
Okay, a lot. They bought Dooley's Yacht Basin, which had been the place where some of the naval ships had been manufactured during World War II.
Okay.
And they bought it, but they were on their honeymoon, believe it or not, bought this yachting basin, took it over. By the early 1950s, they had secured the largest naval contracts in the state of Florida for, at that time, which was very large draft, but wooden hull, and they were, I'm going to get this, They were minesweepers post World War II, purchased by NATO through the U.S. Navy, and it was the largest naval contract in Florida.
So, just out of curiosity, because it all ties back to transportation, because you got to get supplies here, you got to bring people here. This large wood framed hulls, was the wood coming from trees locally, or was it actually coming from? Is it coming down the railroad?
Yeah, it would have come the railroad.
So the railroad actually carried a lot of other things than people, is what I can interpret.
And maybe by that time some Port Everglades too, because it would have been really large acquisitions. And also by then, remember, Broward County was 80% marsh, right?
Right.
In the early days. So that Dade County pine that grew here on the high side, they didn't go very far.
Okay. So we're in the 40s, and we're starting to see, I guess, Sunrise Boulevard existed, Oakland Park Boulevard may have existed. Did the bridges over to the beach, were they created in about that time period?
Sunrise Boulevard first intercoastal bridge was 1947.
Okay.
And the Pier 60, not Pier 66,
17th Street.
17th Street Causeway was in discussion for before the war.
Yeah.
The bridge was supposed to be at 15th, right by 15th Street Fisheries.
Okay.
And believe it or not, there's still some posts in there.
Really?
From where they were trying to put in that original bridge. It never got completed. So then after World War II, I think it was probably, I'm thinking 49 or 50. I just had a discussion with a historian. It might be a couple of years later. That was the very first intercoastal crossing at 17th Street Causeway.
Wow.
So there was limited vehicle access to Fort Lauderdale Beach. But around town, as far as transportation systems, there was a lot of, by that time, probably Broward County transit was beginning to take shape.
That's interesting. We'll have a different conversation of that one day. But so the center of town, and we talked about the train station, and I neglected to ask you the question. Where was that station?
It was right at the river and the FEC tracks.
Perfectly located for the produce. And where we look at center downtown today, where the MPO itself has made an investment on pedestrian improvements and some bikes, and Brightline Station is located there. What was that area like?
Okay, so that was the original Black downtown.
Okay.
And really a huge concentration of Black businesses. And what the Black historians tell us is, in those days, let's say I was a house cleaner and I worked on Las Olas someplace, right? And I got paid twice a week or twice a month, right? But when I came home, I did my grocery shopping, my clothes shopping, and everything right in that Black downtown. So the economic it wasn't an in and out.
Right.
The money stayed in the Black community. So it was very different. So those were that was a huge hub right there behind the mobility hub that you
Right.
was a huge hub for the Black community. And so, famous people like Dana Dorsey, who was the big Miami millionaire, he owned property there, and there's actually a building that he commissioned in 28 that's still standing there.
So real quick, and just a quick aside on that, Dorsey River Bend basically is from that.
Named for him.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So, when we talk about transportation and then we look at equity, and that's actually a huge player, and what actually got me involved in thinking, well, I wanted to get involved with transportation and understand it, when I was a kid, the traditional African-American locations for their community centers were Hammondville Road in Pompano, Hillsborough Boulevard at the railroad tracks. Actually, you're not telling me, and it's because it's not there now, it moved to Sistrunk. So the traditional African-American center was just west of the railroad tracks by the mobility hub. What is that, 2nd Street?
2nd Street.
Yeah. So how did that move? What created, because it was another transportation project? Hopefully not, but what was it that actually...
Well, some of it just transitioned because... remember, at the time, we're in Jim Crow South, and there's redlining, rules in place. So the location on 2nd Street was very close to the line, which was the FEC tracks.
Okay.
And it was safer to be a little further away. So that's kind of how post-World War II, that moved out to Sistrunk, a little further west.
So basically, ironically, they were redlined out of where they had the city. Their businesses. I ask that because equity plays a really big role in transportation. As I was telling you before we started the podcast, MPOs exist because we're the reaction to how the highway department, now departments of transportation, came in to build the interstate highway system, which came out of World War II. And that Eisenhower had this idea that he needed to move troops around. And so knowing that, what happened in Miami in the Overtown area, what happened in Fort Lauderdale at Sunrise Boulevard with a traditional African-American cemetery that actually, and we were talking about it, there are people still buried under the interstate highway. You want to talk a little bit about what just happened in your experience with the little widening that they're doing on 95 now?
Oh, yeah. So whenever there's anything done on that ramp on the east side at Sunrise Boulevard, there's almost an immediate call for an archaeological survey level 2, because this last time when they immediately, as soon as they excavated, they found a human bone. So it's just, some of that movement of this, remember, first of all, we're talking about a Black community that was impoverished.
Yeah.
So, some of those burials were not even in caskets at the time, right? And then when the highway went through, I remember the highway going through, but I never knew about the cemetery in the 1960s. But so they moved some of the grave sides if there was a casket, and they would move a headstone, but they didn't match the headstones to the caskets that they moved. So we lost a lot of people because there's like, for example, Robert Bethel Post, which is the American Legion post right on Sistrunk.
Okay.
He was the most highly decorated World War I veteran African American from Fort Lauderdale. So he's buried in Woodlawn Cemetery.
Okay.
Reuben Stacy, which you've heard a lot about, the renaming of the street and everything, the 1935 lynching victim, he is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. So there's a lot of early Black leaders and in the community, heroes of the community that are buried at Woodlawn.
So, when you look at that type of equity issue that was created, that they were treated poorly, and that is actually, again, we were MPOs. was a reaction to having the voices of the minority communities not being heard for transportation projects, especially federalized transportation projects. So, when you look around, and there's no video on this, but we're sitting in a room with a whole bunch of chairs and mics, and you look at all the seats and you realize that it's the purpose of the organization isn't just the transportation planning, isn't just the idea of where do we put the next, express bus system or next train system or next. It is really, are we doing this in the right places? Are we meeting the needs of all the people? And that many voices, I love the e plurimis unum thing. It's out of many, we are one. And, I look at transportation and I go, okay, well, this is what we're supposed to be doing. But we have to learn from our history. And we have to know why things happened in different ways. The description of how we got to 1960s Broward County is kind of a really fascinating role, because what happened in Miami-Dade, people know about what happened up in Palm Beach with the burning of the African-American settlement on the north end of Palm Beach Island, and everybody got moved to Pleasant City. Nice name for something that was probably one of the worst experiences you could have in your life. You go, okay, well, there is this tied togetherness of our transportation growth and equity conversation. And now I look at Broward County and you go, okay, we're now a majority minority community. And that's really an awesome place to be, because now it's like you can actually turn and have these type of conversations. And this purpose of the podcast is have this oral history so people know it. So now 95 is being built. You and I remember 95 being built. We remember 595, or the Port Everglades Expressway, coming in. The Sawgrass Expressway was built, and that was a county facility. There was a county highway organization that actually operated that before it went to the Florida Turnpike. And the Florida Turnpike was already here. That was a 50s thing. So how did that impact Fort Lauderdale, and how did that impact historically? Because your area, a lot of the buildings in the historic area weren't even there. They were from somewhere else. So do you want to get into some conversation of that?
So post 1960 and all those things that came. So I think the in my mind, transit is tied to the land development by this time. But this time, Broward really has become like a model for Miami-Dade and West Palm Beach. It's no longer agricultural. It's very cosmopolitan. It's bedroom communities and suburbs and all of that sort of thing that sprung up like mushrooms during those years. So the call for transportation, I think that I remember I actually lived right off of the 595 when it got opened. I was way out in Davie, so it was like a really big deal when that. Because before
State Road 84.
Oh yes, those were huge deals back then, and a really big game changer as far as commuting went.
Right.
The very far settlements like today, the congestion on those roads, and they've met their purpose, right? Because we're still growing. We're like one of the largest growing counties in the country still.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just I think in my mind it's that the thing I find interesting today is that people who are moving here are people who are from like my hometown. When I came as a little child, my hometown's Pittsburgh. Well, Pittsburgh's been a transit city forever and ever, right?
Oh, yeah.
My mother didn't drive when we came here. We used the buses all the time. Oh. Mother was a city girl. We had been buses and subways in Pittsburgh all of our lives. So I just think I see the call, and I see the interest in people who are maybe some of them new transplants to get those kind of systems in place now so that we have better options in the future.
I think that, I think that's where it's headed. I'm from here, but my grandmother actually and grandparents lived in Pittsburgh too.
Oh, really? How cool.
Yeah, in off of the Monongahela River in Homestead, actually.
Okay.
But an area that no one goes to anymore. But I remember as a child going up there with my grandmother. My grandmother didn't drive until she came here, or actually she didn't even drive here. She walked to Publix. But the whole idea of getting on the trolley car and going to shopping and all the rest of it. Do you think maybe there was a visceral reaction to the new people that arrived here in Broward that they didn't want to necessarily, when they came here, have that same experience they had in the Northeast or Midwest?
Well, I think that was probably possible in those early days because we weren't as crowded.
Right.
But I think today,
there's no choice.
I've always been kind of blown away because, I ran the Sun Trolley years ago. But like my son, my oldest son who lives in the downtown, when he very often would take the express bus that from Tri-Rail down to work. And, he was always so surprised that not more people use those terrific services. So I just think I'm excited about some of the new people moving into the county that maybe have this experience of, transit's good. I don't know why the rest of us didn't use transit more. I don't.
Well, and because it was an interesting what you said, and I was thinking about when my grandmother, she got a little 1-bedroom apartment in Pompano Beach, on the beach area for like $7,000, $8,000, and she never drove, so she would take the bus. There was a private bus that used to run up and down on A1A. And so she would use that to go to the Oceanside Plaza. There was a little private grocery store there. You walk over the bridge, there was a Publix. Pantry Pride was around the corner. And so, her whole world was just very tight. But there wasn't as many people, like you were saying. And so, maybe that's why I look at where we're headed, and I'm excited by it because we have such great opportunity. But it also, I think people are fearful of it. Of that future too. I was reading an article in the Sun Sentinel the other day about East-West transit, and there was some conversation, I don't believe it's going to make things better and all the rest. But what choices do we have? And I think from a historical perspective, and that's really what I was excited about having you come on, is from history, what do we take back and we learn and go, what could we have done better then that would have helped set us up better for our future? And not for nothing, and if you go to browardmpo.org, we have a section there that is a 1972 design book. It was a design book that was created by the predecessor to the Broward MPO on land use and transportation and other facilities, like where hospitals should be located, where they should have schools, all the way down to greenways and transit. And to be honest with you, they're the same quarters today that they're still looking at to put things in. So from your concept of dealing with the Historic Society, what is that we can bring forward from the history and understand what we should be looking for?
I think the thing that strikes, and one of our historians wrote this in a book, the innovation of those early people, they weren't afraid to just try it. Like, the guys who dredged those Los Olos Isles on Los Olos, who knew that was really going to work, right? Or people would really want to live there, or that would be a cool thing. And now it's like the hottest property in town. Okay, so that kind of thing. And the idea that we had, if there's going to be transportation hubs or places where we can do transit-oriented development, where people can live and get on transit and not necessarily have cars. Because I live in the downtown and I'm waiting for those days when I do not have to have a car. So I think it's a mindset too. It seems to me that those early pioneers had this mindset that we're going to do what we have to do and make it happen. And I see the pullback with some of the old timers like me in town that no more towers, no more building, no more and it's like, well, how are you going to get around,
Right.
and what's your tax base going to be? And so I just think, that whole difference is that those early people that settled Broward County had this sort of very entrepreneurial, we'll find a way to make this work thing.
So what I'm going to take from this, and I hope our listeners do, is if you live in Broward County or you're planning to come here, bring the spirit of innovation. And that, Patricia, I appreciate your time here today.
I love it, Greg. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for coming.
The Let's Talk Transportation podcast is produced by the Broward MPO, where every day we fund and implement projects that move people and goods, create jobs, and strengthen communities. Learn more at browardmpo.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Speak Up Broward. If there is a transportation topic you'd like to know more about, let us know by sending an email to info@browardmpo.org.